The idea of setting up this kind of commission and wasting taxpayers' money on it, I think, is just absurd. And to be given a kind of course in political correctness by the Labour establishment, I think, is just totally unacceptable. I think we should all defend our statues from Sadiq Khan's plaques.
Hello, I'm Darren Grimes and welcome to Recent UK. Please do consider hitting that little subscribe button and the notification bell. Now, it's been quite the torrid year for the past and character of this country. Our greatest wartime leaders have been branded as racist, their statues defaced. Every week there seems to be a new discovery of some link to slavery and cancellation for a part of our history or a statue linked to it. This week we heard, thanks to Gareth Bacon MP, that the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has approved up to £247,000 for the Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm to ensure London statues are diverse enough. Khan announced plans for the commission in June after a statue of Edward Colston, a philanthropist who made his fortune from the slave trade, was toppled by protesters in Bristol. Now, I want to discuss with an eminent historian if the attempts to denigrate and even destroy Britain's history is at all a justifiable phenomenon. Fortunately, I know of just the man. Zareer Masani has an Oxford history doctorate and is the author of 4 previous historical books, including a widely acclaimed biography of the former Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. He spent 2 decades as a current affairs producer for the BBC, and I believe, Zaria, you remain a freelance broadcaster on BBC Radio, is that right?
If they still have me.
Maybe after this, Zaria, they won't.
Well, they're becoming increasingly woke, which is the situation for the rest of us.
How does that make you feel quite sad as someone who worked for such a long time at the BBC?
Well, no, I suppose people like me have had our day. And I mean, I think it's fine that they should be using younger people and people of your generation rather than mine. Fair enough. But I think there is a tendency to talk very much to the left liberal Remain voting elite. I mean, I'm a soft Remainer, so I don't feel strongly one way or the other, but I think the BBC swung too much to one extreme.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of swinging too much to one extreme, I wonder if, first of all, you might discuss your thoughts around Sadiq Khan's Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm. It's surely a laudable aim to take down statues that represent parts of our past that we're no longer comfortable with and to place up new statues to figures that we are, isn't it?
Well, I think statues have gone up and down over the millennia, and I don't think there's anything sacred about them. But at the same time, I think it's not really at all desirable for us to go around removing statues of people who temporarily we disapprove of. When they made major donations, major charitable enterprises, etc. And I think those statues are sort of honoring them and honoring our past. And if necessary, we can sort of re-explain that past. But I don't think removing it helps anyone.
So, Zaria, I wonder if we might go back a little bit and to discuss what is it that actually, why are you so passionate about history in general, but especially the history of Britain, about defending British history from those who seek to denigrate and even destroy it?
Well, I went to a very good Anglican school in Bombay, as we then called it, and I still do. And we had English teachers, several, and we were taught English history. It was called English history in those days. And we were taught very well. So my love of English history and literature goes back to, when I was 6 or 7. And then my parents encouraged it. They were quite interested in history, and I was given lots of children's books about it. And of course, I graduated from those to reading other novels and history books. So my reading was pretty historical. And then when I had to choose a subject to graduate in, it seemed natural to go for history. And, I've never looked back in that sense. And British history was always an important part of it. Uh, we also did European history and some Indian history. And I think today, students in Bombay wouldn't be taught English history, I'm afraid.
Mm. I wonder then, does that give you a sort of sense of perspective of how we should actually feel about our past, as a historian as well, looking at back through the archives, etc., etc. How should we approach it? Because there are elements we should be less proud of, and elements that we should be immensely proud of. But how do you approach history as at a time when it's such a sensitive issue and provokes immense feeling from both sides?
Well, I was always brought up to look at the British legacy and the imperial legacy as something that was positive in parts, negative in others, but overwhelmingly more positive than negative. And my father served several jail sentences protesting against the Raj, but he also used to say that the British played cricket with us, and we could never have had non-violent protest if they hadn't been very tolerant and treated us as political prisoners. So there was always great respect for the British legacy in that sense. And my parents were very Anglophile. And when I look at the British legacy, I mean, I can see that there was the occasional massacre, there was occasional slavery, there was also the complete antithesis of that in the fact that the British gave India a century of internal peace. They abolished slavery in India. So I think these were all considerable achievements.
Mm. Yes. Well, why do you think then that the nuances are lost, especially at the moment? Why do you think there seems to be an activist class that is determined to try and suggest that there is nothing to be proud of about being British, that actually this is nothing other than a racist backwater with an absolutely horrible imperial past?
Well, I think partly we've imported what's been happening across the Atlantic.
Mm.
So I think the American legacy of slavery, etc., is rather different from Britain's. Um, Also, Britain and the West generally have attracted the highest number of immigration from areas that were previously colonized. So clearly, the people who were colonized felt that the ex-mother countries had quite a lot to offer them. So I would say today, it's easier to be a Black or ethnic minority person in Britain than it would be in the countries of origin of most of the people who've come here, because those countries of origin almost exclusively are dictatorships or have civil wars. So I think Britain offers a kind of opportunity and race equality through the strictest legislation in the world. So I think it's completely absurd for people to launch what I call Black Lives Madness in attempts to kind of promote themselves, because what we're seeing is a small elite of well-heeled Black and ethnic minority people actually getting preferential treatment or demanding it for promotion to jobs and positions of power, which they don't seem to be able to get on their merits.
I wonder then if you might be able to reflect a little bit on the question of, would the world indeed have been better without the British Empire ever existing?
No, I think certainly not, because I think empires through the millennia have done more good than harm. They've brought diverse peoples together. They've created multicultural spaces. They have created great scientific and economic progress. And I think the British Empire more than most, because I think the whole modern free enterprise, free trade world was created by the British Empire with all its faults. I mean, no empire is free of them, and all empires involve some element of force. But the British Empire, much less than most, and it was based largely on consent. And I don't think we would have the modern world today if it wasn't for the British Empire.
Uh, Yeah, I mean, could you just expand on that a little bit? I mean, what do you think the British Empire gave the modern world? What were the foundations of empire that laid the seeds or planted the seeds to get us to where we are and enjoy the fruits of modern progress?
Well, I think it, starts with Magna Carta, which was pretty unique, and we were taught it at school. And then we had parliamentary democracy, and it's not accidental that virtually every uh, ex-colony of the British Empire is today a democracy of some kind. Not perfect, but largely democratic. And I can't think of hardly any ex-colonies of France or Portugal or Spain that are still democracies today. So I think there's the huge legacy of democracy. And the British introduced it in stages in different parts of the empire, along with education, which was another big bonus. And of course, there was a huge economic improvement, free trade within the empire, certainly, free movement of very scarce capital in most of the developing world. Capital is the most scarce resource, and British capital was made available on a huge scale to countries like India and elsewhere. Railways, and of course, the rule of law, which certainly we didn't have in most of Asia or Africa. The idea that governments had to obey their own laws and a
Property
justice
rights and
system.
things like that.
Absolutely. And the British certainly campaigned against untouchability in India much more than the present government does.
Could you just explain what that is for an audience that might not know?
Well, untouchability disenfranchised about a third of the population as being from low caste groups within Hinduism, and they were not given the right to enter temples, large areas of towns, uh, much in the way that blacks and Jews were ghettoized in the early phases of European civilizations. So I think the British reacted against that. They made untouchability illegal in India. And they were also immensely progressive in the way they treated women, because women's rights were promoted very strongly within the British Empire. Education for girls, which was not very common in Asian countries. In India, they banned the burning of Hindu widows, which was quite common before the
Wow.
British Raj.
So are critics of the current curriculum in the UK right when they say that we don't talk about our nation's sins enough? A lot of people might say, well, yeah, okay, India got some railways, but the occupation of India was completely intolerable and unjustifiable.
Well, I think most of the world was occupied by imperial forces at some time or another, because if it wasn't the British, it was the French or the Spanish. If it wasn't the French or the Spanish, it was the Chinese or the Aztecs in South America. So empires were pretty universal. And I think the British Empire really did more than most to actually bring together different religions, different communities, and impose a kind of rule of law and rights for everyone. I'm sorry, I've lost the other part of your question.
It was just whether or not there are some that argue that the curriculum, as far as history is concerned, doesn't actually get the balance right in criticizing or highlighting the sins of our past.
Well, I'm not an expert on school curriculum, but from the impression I have, there is teaching of things like slavery, also the abolition of slavery, and of the empire having been a mixed blessing. I think, if anything, the curriculum and the teachers tend to err on the side of being very anti colonial, anti imperial, and knocking its benefits. So I don't think the curriculum is biased in that respect. But I think certainly there needs to be more history teaching and more resources for it.
Yes. And are there any good arguments then, for going back to the statues question, are there any good arguments for removing a statue? Are there statues in Britain that are worthy of being removed lawfully? I mean, can you think of a single one that you'd like to remove yourself?
No, I can't think of any statues that I would want to remove. I think it was very unfortunate that the Bristol Colston statue was pulled down, because whatever we think of Colston today, he did do an enormous amount for Bristol in terms of setting up the whole fabric of the city council and its infrastructure. So I think maybe it could have been relocated. Maybe there could have been more explanatory plaques about his role in the slave trade. But equally, I think we need to recognize that Britain, I don't think, does enough to celebrate its role in abolishing slavery. I mean, the transatlantic slave trade was a very small part of global slavery. In fact, according to the Global Slavery Index today, Africa is the continent with the highest amount of slavery, and Nigeria leads with 9.5 million slaves today. So I think the Black Lives Matters campaign ought to be addressing slavery where it's worst and not where it was abolished 200 years ago.
What do you think about comparisons by the likes of the academic Kinde Andrews, who has argued actually that the British Empire, he's compared the British Empire to the Nazis?
Well, it's quite a common trope among the Black Lives Madness people to talk about the Holocaust and the British Empire in the same breath. I think it's insulting to the victims of the Holocaust and their descendants, because there's nothing that quite equals the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust. And I think it's absurd to compare British massacres, however minor they were, with the liquidation of 6 million Jews. I mean, there is absolutely no analogy to be drawn. And I think it's quite offensive, actually, that comparison is made, offensive both to the British legacy, but even more so, I think, to the Holocaust legacy.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I want to focus then now on, I mentioned at the start, one statue in particular that that really got people on both sides of the argument really quite upset. And it really proved that this is a real minority view in some cases, as far as the views of Churchill, Sir Winston Churchill. That provoked a lot of upset by the British people, that this wartime leader who invokes a deep sense of patriotism within the hearts and minds of many Brits, even today. And the way in which his statue was defaced, you had racist smeared on it, in graffitied on it in spray paint. And there was a lot of upset that the police just stood by and let this happen. And then, of course, they guarded it eventually, and it couldn't happen again. But I wonder, could you just, I know you've you've recently rather wrote a piece for The Critic on Churchill. I wonder if you might be able to reflect on those that do smear Sir Winston Churchill as a racist. Do you think he was an inherently racist man?
Look, Churchill was born in Victorian times. Most people who were born in Victorian times were racist, whether they were British, Indian, Chinese, or African. Racism was pretty universal, especially based around skin color. I mean, even today, if you look at the matrimonial adverts in India, they all specify fair-skinned people. So this is something universal. Yes, Churchill had his racist moments. Yes, he made the occasional remark, partly out when he was annoyed about Indians launching civil disobedience in the middle of World War II, and saw this as a bit of a stab in the back. And yes, he let off steam, and he said things that he didn't particularly mean, or which he said to shock. He also enjoyed joking in a certain way, which used a certain kind of humor that wouldn't be acceptable today. But I think these were pretty minor faults compared with the enormous achievements. And I don't think that we would be here sitting and talking today if it
Hmm.
wasn't for Churchill. So I think it's perfectly understandable that British people should continue to respect his legacy and defend his statue from the kind of defacements that have been going on.
Do you think then there should, some have argued, and that's what Sadiq Khan's commission is looking at doing, putting a plaque on to say, this character has links to X, Y, and Z as a sort of way of highlighting the negative parts of that character's past. What do you think of that sort of thing for Churchill?
I think it's absurd. I think Sadiq Khan ought to be looking to his own antecedents. I'm sure there are racists there. And I think the idea of setting up this kind of commission and wasting taxpayers' money on it, I think is just absurd. And to be given a kind of course in political correctness by the Labour establishment, I think is just totally unacceptable. I think we should all defend our statues from Sadiq Khan's plaques.
Yes. And I wonder then if you might highlight. I spoke about that piece that you wrote for The Critic. It's a very good piece. But this is one, the left love to use the Bengal famine as a way in which you can say, well, there you are. That proves that Sir Winston Churchill deliberately wanted to starve India in 1943, and that proves he's a racist.
Well, there are several flaws in that argument. Firstly, Churchill wasn't in a position to starve anyone. He didn't micromanage. He had broad oversight. He was a very elderly, very ailing person who did not look in detail at what was happening on the ground. Secondly, he had no particular reason to starve Bengal in India. It was the middle of World War II. He was fighting with his back to the wall to prevent Britain from going under to Nazi Germany. The last thing that was on his mind was starving Indians. He wanted the 2 million strong Indian army to be fighting. It was a volunteer army, and they were fighting on the British side. He wanted to keep India on side. He certainly didn't want to punish India at that stage. So, secondly, I think what I have looked at and shown in some detail is that there were about 1 million tons of food grains that he had shipped to India in that year of famine, which actually relieved the famine in the end. And it was a man made famine. It wasn't actually a shortage of food, it was hoarding of food by merchants who were taking advantage of wartime speculation and shortages to hike up prices.
Yes. Well, yes, I wish there was a more of a way in which we could actually just have these sorts of conversations and reach a nuanced position where we actually look at historical fact and record instead of just smearing people and jumping to conclusions like that. That's smear one of our greatest prime ministers. It's lazy to me. It strikes me as incredibly lazy. But I wonder then if you might have any thoughts about the way in which the likes of the BBC, our state broadcaster, and I don't know if it's any secret to you, Zareer Masani, but I am not a fan of the licence fee or the BBC. And I think the BBC's reporting of these sorts of issues, you referred to Black Lives Matter as Black Lives Madness earlier. And the BBC, when we had the protests in which a significant number of officers, police officers, were harmed in said protests, the BBC described them as largely peaceful protests. Now, this sort of seemed like Orwellian doublespeak to me, and I just wondered if you've been sort of in dismay at the way in which the BBC has been reporting the phenomenon, that's the madness that's taken place this year.
Absolutely. I mean, I've worked for the BBC. I've been very pro BBC in the past. However, I have launched a formal complaint against the way that news bulletins have been promoting the Black Lives Madness or Black Lives Matter case and ignoring opinions against it. So it's a completely one-sided presentation and portrayal. And my formal complaint has now been languishing for about 8 months, and it keeps getting kicked around within the BBC from one department to another. I haven't had a proper reply to it. They send me automated messages saying it's being dealt with. So, the BBC complaints process is in a complete shambles. And I do think they are very biased in favor of the Black Lives Matter campaign and anything that references slavery, anything that references racism, and they present one side of the argument and they don't make the attempt to present the other side, which in my time was absolutely essential. You couldn't just have a reporter voicing their opinion or interviewing people of one shade of opinion and not having other opinions.
So, Zaria, if I had the power, if it was in my gift to make you Director General of the BBC tomorrow, how would you bring the BBC more in touch with the public and get back to the sort of style of reporting that was common when you were at the Beeb?
Well, I think a part of it is to do with editorial guidelines from the top actually being followed, because the editorial guidelines that we worked with were very much about impartiality. And I think the BBC has lost that impartiality. I'm not a Brexiteer, but I can totally sympathize with the way that Brexiteers feel, because you hardly ever hear a Brexiteer on programs like Question Time and Newsnight, etc. It's completely, you'd think the whole country was Remainer if you just listened to the BBC or watched it. So I think the top needs to be, I think we need people at the top. I would have been delighted if Charles Moore had been appointed chairman.
Yes, yes.
I think he would have shaken it up. It needs a shake-up. It needs to have direction from the top. It also needs to recruit people, both presenters and producers, from different shades of opinion. Now, even in my time, I have to admit that there was hardly a Tory voter in my department, Current Affairs of the BBC. We were all either Labour or Lib Dem voters. So I think there is this complete disconnect between at least half the country, which the BBC needs to do something about.
Yes, it strikes me that it's cultural conservatism. The BBC talks a lot, of course, about its diversity problem. To me, the only diversity problem the BBC has is the fact that cultural conservatives and the working class don't really seem to have any involvement in the one decision-making process, but two in the programs as well.
Well, I don't think I can't see a mechanism whereby you would have the public making that kind of day-to-day input. But as I say, I think it could be done by appointing the right people at the top and also recruitment policies reflecting that new approach.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it needs a shake-up,
Hmm.
um, definitely.
Now, what do you think about those that say that Britain should return artifacts and treasures of other nations that the empire won, reaped as the spoils of war and occupation, shall we say, and currently reside in our museums, for example? There's a lot of noise by the British Museum in particular. Is this a morally complex issue, do you think?
I think art and antiquities have traveled across the world for millennia, either by conquest or gift or sale. So there are all sorts of ways in which items have moved around. And I think the idea of returning them to their place of origin, where they were made 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, is completely reactionary because firstly, the population in those areas has changed over the millennia. So the people who made the objects no longer exist. Who would you return them to? So you take something like the Kohinoor diamond, which is in one of the Queen's crowns, and the demand that it should be returned. But returned to whom? To India, to Iran, to Afghanistan. They've all owned it at different stages and conquered it from other peoples. So I think art and antiquities should stay where they are. I think we also need to recognize that the global museums like the British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum in New York are huge global resources. So they have footfall of millions, which would not be at all replicated in the places of origin. And they conserve these objects in a way that they would never have been conserved. There were no museums in India until the British set them up because museums are not part of Indian culture. Indian culture is about throwing away things as soon as they become old and antiquated. So you don't keep old things, you don't celebrate ruins. It was the British who created the desire for these things, started conserving them, excavating them, set up the museums in countries like India and Nigeria and elsewhere. And I am totally opposed to returning anything except objects that have been stolen within living memory. And I'm thinking of the Holocaust victims' art collections, where there are survivors to whom they belonged. We can establish the property rights, and those people should be entitled to have their art back. But I don't think people who uh, are disconnected from art that was made thousands of years ago have any right to them.
Yes. Now, Zaria, I wonder if to end, you might be a voice of hope for those who have been a bit upset by what's happened this year in their country, who don't recognise what's happening in their country, who look at those who say that their nation is a racist backwater, who want to denigrate and destroy parts of our past, who don't wish us well, and want to keep them at an arm's length. Yet, organisations like the BBC, the Mayor of London, seem to be wanting to draw these people in, to give a voice and a platform to these people. And most of the nation feels very, very upset and threatened by this. And I wonder if you might be a voice of hope for them. Are you optimistic? Just your end remarks. Are you optimistic about common sense winning out in the end in what you've coined madness, the modern madness?
I think, common sense will win out in the end because I think common sense is a great British virtue. I think there is a tendency, as you say, among the left liberal chattering classes to try and be trendy by espousing all these sort of anti national, anti British causes. But I think that is a fashion that's going to die out. I would like to see a much stronger, more positive role being played by the government. I think if you had someone like Mrs. Thatcher in charge, there would be a much more kind of dynamic, assertive approach from number 10 on these issues. It's gone completely silent and becoming, if anything, rather complicit with this. So I think I would like to see a much more militant approach from the powers that be to challenge this.
Yes. Well, Dr. Zareer Masani, I could talk to you all day long, so thank you very much for giving up your time and speaking to reason today.
Thank you, Darren. And, I think ultimately the future lies with people like you who will be challenging the kind of absurdities you've highlighted.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And you, of course, give us the ammunition with your writings and all the rest of it. So thank you very much for all that you do. Now, I'm sure you at home will be absolutely desperate to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell after watching that. Absolutely fascinating stuff. And I will see you next time.